March 12, 1974. The Washington Post newsroom was a symphony of chaos, the clatter of typewriters, the ringing of telephones, the urgent shouts of editors chasing deadlines. But in the quiet corner of the letters department, Joan Higgins sat in a pool of silence, created by a single, cheap envelope. It was gray, unassuming, with no return address. The postmark read Charleston, West Virginia. She slid it open with her letter knife and unfolded a single sheet of paper, torn from a child's spiral notebook. The handwriting was a jagged scrawl, the letters lurching across the page as if the writer's hand couldn't stop shaking. The first few lines were a plea for help, something Joan had seen 1,000 times. Then she froze. She read the words again, her breath catching in her throat. 14 years she'd been an editor. She'd read letters exposing corrupt politicians, crooked union bosses, and corporate fraud. But she had never, ever read anything like this. A man named Thomas Miller wrote that in a children's home, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, children were being murdered. Not by accident, not from disease, deliberately, with needles and 4 drips. He claimed it had been happening for 11 years. He listed names: Billy, Grace, Robert, Dinah, Adam. The list went on, a ghostly roll call of nearly 24 names he could remember. He remembered every last one of them. He remembered how they vanished in the night. He remembered the smell of the infirmary, a sterile, biting mix of bleach, rubbing alcohol, and something else, something sickeningly sweet. And he remembered the nurse, Amelia Thorne. Nurse Amy, they called her. A quiet woman with a long, dark braid. He wrote how she once stroked his hair, her touch as cold as the linoleum floor, and whispered, "You're a strong boy. You'll survive." Joan pushed the letter away, her own hands now trembling. She reached for a pack of Chesterfields, lighting one with a flick of her Zippo, even though she'd quit 3 years ago. This letter would never be published. She knew that instantly. It wasn't a story for the morning edition. It was a dark secret that needed to be brought not to the public, but to a place far more powerful. Within 2 days, a copy of this letter would be on a desk at the FBI headquarters. A week later, it would be reviewed by the West Virginia State Police. And a month after that, a special investigative team from Washington would drive into the misty hollows of Appalachia, heading for a place called the Oak Ridge Children's Home. But to understand the true depth of the horror they were about to uncover, we have to go back. Back 11 years, to 1963. To a small, mountain-shadowed town, and to a grim, 2-story building on its outskirts, where 120 children, who had no one in the world, were about to learn that some angels don't come to save you. They come to set you free. The town of Hollow Creek, West Virginia, sits in a deep valley carved by time and a tired river. To the east and west, the Appalachian Mountains rise like colossal green walls, stealing the sun by 4 o'clock every afternoon, plunging the town into a premature twilight. It's a place built on coal and quiet desperation. By 1963, it was a typical slice of forgotten America. A single main street with a 5 and dime, a gas station, and a movie theater that had been showing The Birds for 6 months straight. Life here moved at the speed of a rusty pickup truck, slow and predictable. Summer brought a thick, humid heat that made the asphalt soft. Winter brought a damp, bone-aching cold that never seemed to leave the shadows. In the center of town, there were modest clapboard houses and a few brick buildings for the town officials. But the farther you got from the main street, the poorer it became. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt. And on the absolute fringe of town, where the valley floor began its steep climb into the forested hills, stood the Oak Ridge Children's Home. The building itself looked like a scar on the landscape. It was a 2-story brick structure, erected in the late 1930s, its once red bricks now faded to a dull mottled brown. The small windows were covered with thick wire mesh, not to keep burglars out, but to keep the children in. In the yard, a rusted swing set creaked mournfully in the wind, and an American flag, bleached by years of sun and rain, hung limply from a metal pole. This was home to 120 children, aged 4 to 14. They were the forgotten ones. The orphans, the abandoned, the children of prisoners and alcoholics. Some had been here since birth, dropped off by a social worker and a state-issued form. Others arrived after a family tragedy, their small worlds shattered by death or disaster. They owned nothing. Their clothes were state issue, with a black ink stamp on the collar. Their shoes were handed down from the children who came before them. They slept on iron frame beds with sagging wire mesh springs, under thin, gray wool blankets that smelled perpetually of mothballs and disinfectant. Every day was the same. Wake up at 7. Line up for calisthenics in the yard, even when frost covered the ground. Breakfast was watery oatmeal, a slice of bread, and weak, unsweetened tea. School lessons until lunch. Lunch was a thin soup, more oatmeal, and watery juice. Afternoons were for chores until dinner. Dinner was, you guessed it, more oatmeal, bread, and tea. Bedtime was at 9. 365 days a year, year after year, until you turned 14 and were shipped off to a trade school or simply turned out onto the street. If you lived that long, death in America's orphanages was a topic no one wanted to discuss. Officially, every child was guaranteed a safe, healthy upbringing. In reality, overcrowding, poor sanitation, and disease were rampant. Measles, dysentery, and tuberculosis could sweep through a facility like a wildfire, and in the winter, the sound of coughing was a constant, rattling chorus in the dormitories. But at Oak Ridge, the death rate was consistently higher than the state average. No one seemed to find this strange. The official explanation was always the same. These were weak children, born into poverty and sickness. A commission from the state capitol might visit once a year, but they were always easily satisfied. Director Sterling knew how to put on a good show. No one ever asked the hard questions. Why are these specific children dying? Why do they always die at night? And why does it always happen after a visit to the infirmary? No one asked, except for the children themselves. And in a place like Oak Ridge, no one listens to a child. Her full name was Amelia Thorne. In 1963, she was 34 years old. She was a woman of medium height, slender, with dark, watchful eyes and a long, black braid that she kept coiled tightly in a bun beneath her white nurse's cap. Her hands were dry and chapped, with neatly trimmed nails, and they always carried the faint, sharp scent of bleach and rubbing alcohol, the professional perfume of a nurse. She had been working at Oak Ridge for 2 years, having transferred from a county clinic in 1961. She could have stayed at the clinic, a stable, respectable job, but she chose the children's home. The reason why was a secret she kept locked deep inside her. Amelia was born in 1929 in a tiny, dirt-poor coal mining camp 50 miles from Hollow Creek. Her father was a miner, her mother a homemaker. They lived in a company shack, perpetually in debt to the company store. She was the third of 6 children. In 1941, her father was killed in a mine collapse. The company gave her mother a $50 sympathy payment and evicted them from the shack. Her mother was left alone with 6 mouths to feed. 2 of her younger siblings died of malnutrition in the winter of '43. Another died of typhus the following year. But Amelia survived. She was tough, stubborn. She started working at the age of 12, cleaning houses for the mine supervisors, her small hands raw from lye soap and harsh brushes. She slept 4 hours a night and ate whatever scraps were left over. After the war, she enrolled in a nursing program in Charleston. It was her only ticket out of poverty, a state-sponsored education, a scholarship, a bed in a dormitory. She was a good student. Her instructors praised her for her precision, her attention to detail, her steady hand with a needle. In 1954, she married a man named Al, a handsome, charming truck driver who loved a good time. A year later, she gave birth to their first child, a boy they named Timothy. He died 3 months later from a congenital heart defect. The doctors said there was nothing they could have done. In 1956, their second child, a girl named Sarah, died from dysentery at 6 months old. In 1957, a third child, a boy they called Michael, survived. But by then, Al was drinking every day. The charming man she married had become a violent, abusive drunk. Her life was a living hell. One day in 1958, Al packed a bag, took their son Michael, and just left. He never said where he was going. He simply vanished. Amelia searched for him for 3 years, filing police reports, pleading with investigators. But it was useless. In the vastness of America, a man and a boy could disappear without a trace. By 1963, Amelia Thorne was living alone in a small room in a boarding house on the edge of town. Her world had been reduced to a bed, a chair, and a single, faded photograph of her son, Michael, on the wall. He was 2 years old in the picture. He would have been 6 now, if he was even still alive. Every night, Amelia would stare at that photograph, and a part of her would die all over again. Something inside of her had broken long ago. Maybe it was when her baby brothers starved to death. Maybe it was when her firstborn died in her arms. Or maybe it was the day her husband stole her only remaining child. Something vital, something human, had been hollowed out of her. And in its place, something else had grown. Something cold, calm, and utterly convinced of its own righteousness. Amelia Thorne didn't see herself as a monster. On the contrary, she believed with every fiber of her being that she was performing an act of profound kindness. She was freeing the weak from their suffering. She was cleansing the world of those who were already doomed. It wasn't cruelty, it was mercy. At least, that's how she saw it. At the children's home, she was respected. Quiet, efficient, never late. She arrived at 8 and left at 6. Always in a starched white uniform, her braid perfectly coiled, a faint, unreadable half-smile on her lips. The director, Arthur Sterling, was pleased with her. She never caused trouble, never complained about her meager salary, never asked for time off. She just did her job. Her work was simple. Morning rounds to check for fevers. During the day, she'd patch up the scraped knees and bruised elbows that were the constant byproduct of childhood. In the evening, she'd distribute medications. And then there was the infirmary. It was a small room at the end of the first-floor hallway. The walls were covered in white tile, cracked and yellowing with age. In the center stood an iron examination table covered with a worn vinyl mattress. A glass-fronted cabinet held syringes, bandages, and vials of medicine. The room reeked of that signature scent, bleach, alcohol, and that other cloying, sweet smell. The children were terrified of this room. Not because Nurse Amy was cruel. She never shouted, never hit them. She spoke in a soft, almost gentle voice, stroking their hair and calling them honey or sweetie. They were afraid of something else, something they couldn't name, but could feel in their bones. Any child who went into the infirmary in the evening didn't always come back out. In the morning, their bunk would be empty. The sheets stripped, the thin mattress flipped over, as if they had never existed. The caregivers would say the child got sick and was taken to the hospital, or that they were transferred to another home. Or more often, they would say nothing at all. The children knew the truth. But they stayed silent, too. Who could they tell? Who would ever believe a 7-year-old orphan? So they whispered their warnings in the dark, under their scratchy wool blankets. Nurse Amy takes the ones who cry at night. Nurse Amy doesn't like it when you don't eat your oatmeal. Nurse Amy is always watching. If she calls you to the infirmary after dinner, don't go. But how could you not go when a caregiver took you by the hand and led you down the cold, echoing hall? The children were powerless. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The director of the Oak Ridge Children's Home was a man named Arthur Sterling. At 52, he was a portly, imposing figure with a perpetually flushed face and a roadmap of broken capillaries on his nose. He was a former mid-level state politician, a man who once had a promising career until his alcoholism and a series of public scandals got him demoted. This job, running a forgotten orphanage in the middle of nowhere, was his punishment. It was a form of political exile, the last stop before he hit rock bottom. Sterling knew this and had accepted his fate. His only goal was to keep a low profile, avoid any more trouble, and ride it out until he could collect his pension. His office was a small, musty room on the second floor. A portrait of President Kennedy hung crookedly on the wall, a silent witness to his fall from grace. His desk was buried under mountains of paperwork, next to a water carafe that everyone knew held gin, not water. The smell of stale booze and regret clung to the curtains and was impossible to air out. Sterling was usually at the home from 9 to 5. He'd sign papers, hold pointless meetings, and occasionally take a perfunctory stroll through the dormitories. Twice a year, when the state commission came to visit, he'd put on a freshly pressed suit, ply them with expensive bourbon, and parade a hand-picked group of the healthiest-looking children in front of them. The commissioners always left satisfied, and their glowing reports went straight to the state capitol. Oak Ridge was not the worst children's home in West Virginia. The death rate was within an acceptable margin, a little high, sure, but that was the case everywhere. Sterling knew children were dying more often than they should. He wasn't a fool. He could read the numbers in his own reports. 4 deaths in 1963, 5 in 64, 6 in 65. The numbers kept climbing, but he didn't want to know why. To know why would be to become responsible. And if he was responsible, he'd have to do something. And if he did something, it would draw attention. And if he drew attention, they might dig into his drinking, his petty embezzling from the home's budget, his falsified reports. So Arthur Sterling chose not to ask questions. He signed the death certificates, stamped them with his official seal, and sent the bodies to the county morgue. Case closed. Amelia Thorne suited him just fine. She was quiet, efficient, and never caused any problems. The cause of death was always listed as natural causes. That's what the doctor's report said. And the doctor should know. That doctor was Evan Albright. He was 41, a thin man with a neatly trimmed mustache and slick, oily hair. He was the county physician, assigned to oversee the children's home. He was supposed to visit once a week, on Thursdays. His visits were a ritual. He'd arrive, share a cup of tea with Sterling in his office, tea that came from the gin carafe, take a quick walk through the dormitories, glancing at the children from a safe distance, and then sign a stack of papers that Nurse Amy had already prepared for him. Then, one more drink for the road, and he was gone. In 7 years, he never conducted a single real medical examination, never made a serious diagnosis, and never asked a single question. Dr. Albright got more than just gin from Sterling. Sometimes it was a box of canned goods from the home's pantry, or a quiet word from the director to make a speeding ticket disappear. Small favors. But from these small favors, a system of silence was built. You do for me, I do for you. You keep quiet, and I'll keep quiet. Dr. Albright signed the death certificates without even looking at the names. The cause of death was always one of the usual suspects: pneumonia, dysentery, cardiac failure. It was a standard, unquestionable list. Who was going to check? These were orphans. They had no family to demand an autopsy, no one to file a complaint. The bodies were taken to the county morgue, which was always understaffed and overflowing. An autopsy for an orphan from Oak Ridge was a mere formality. A quick external look, copy the cause of death from the paperwork, and nail the cheap pine box shut. They were buried in a far, forgotten corner of the town cemetery, the section reserved for the homeless and the unidentified. A simple wooden cross with a number painted on it. No name, no dates. This is how the system worked. Parentless children were a resource to be managed, not individuals to be loved. The state fed them, clothed them, and schooled them, but love was not part of the budget. And if one of them died, well, these things happen. The weak don't survive. It was just natural selection. The government was not to blame. November 1963. A late autumn chill had settled over Hollow Creek. A cold, persistent rain turned the ground to mud, and a thick, gray fog clung to the mountains, erasing them from view. The heating at the children's home was notoriously bad. The old coal furnace sputtered and clanked, and the director was always trying to save money on coal. The temperature in the dormitories hovered around 50 degrees. The children slept in their clothes, huddled under their thin blankets. The sound of coughing was everywhere. Billy Odell was new. He was 7 years old and had arrived 3 months earlier in August. His mother had died of tuberculosis. He had never known his father. The space on his birth certificate was blank. He had no other relatives, or at least none who were willing to take him in. Billy was a small, skinny boy with enormous dark eyes that seemed to swallow his pale face. He barely spoke. He mostly just cried quietly into his pillow every night, whispering the word mama. The caregivers didn't like him. He was a problem. He woke the other children. He refused to eat his oatmeal. He wouldn't listen. He would find a corner and sit there for hours, rocking back and forth. He's defective, one of the caregivers, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, would say. He ought to be in a special home for the mentally deficient. But getting a child transferred required paperwork, commissions, and a lot of hassle. It was easier to just leave him here. Maybe he'd get over it. Amelia Thorne noticed Billy during his second week. She saw him crying at night. She saw him pushing his bowl of oatmeal away. She saw the caregivers yelling at him. She looked at him and saw her own son, Michael, the one her husband had stolen. He could have been just like this. The same dark eyes, the same small, thin frame. What did she feel in that moment? Pity? Pain? Or something else entirely? We will never know for sure. Amelia left no diaries, and during her interrogations, she would speak in clipped, emotionless sentences. Psychiatrists would later fill pages with their analyses, but they would never find the real truth. All we know for certain is this. On the night of November 16th, Amelia Thorne called for Billy Odell to be brought to the infirmary. The boy walked down the long, dark hallway, his bare feet cold against the cracked linoleum. He was wearing a pair of faded blue state-issue pajamas. A caregiver held his hand tightly. "Nurse Amy wants to see you," she said. "Don't be scared." Billy wasn't scared. He didn't feel much of anything anymore. 3 months without his mother had hollowed him out. He was just going through the motions, waking up, eating, sleeping, crying, waiting for something he couldn't name. The infirmary. The white tile, the iron table, the biting smell of bleach and alcohol. Nurse Amy was standing by the cabinet, a calm silhouette in her white uniform and cap. Her dark eyes seemed almost kind. "Lie down, sweetie," she said. "I'm going to help you sleep." The boy lay down. He was obedient. He had been taught to obey adults. Amelia took his small, cold hand. She found a vein in his thin arm, wiped it with an alcohol swab, and took out a syringe. "Don't be afraid," she repeated. "It won't hurt. You'll just fall asleep, and you'll see your mama again." Billy looked up at her. His eyes were empty. He was already gone. The needle slid into his vein. The plunger depressed, pushing the clear liquid into his small body. We don't know exactly what was in that syringe. During the investigation in 1974, forensic analysis would determine that Amelia used a cocktail of drugs, a massive overdose of a powerful sedative, sometimes mixed with potassium chloride, and sometimes simply an injection of air into the vein. The result was always the same: cardiac arrest. A quiet, peaceful death in one's sleep. Billy's eyes closed. Within minutes, his breathing slowed, then stopped. Amelia stood over him, waiting. She checked for a pulse. Then she covered his small body with a sheet. She walked out into the hall and found the caregiver. "Billy Odell has passed," she said calmly. "Heart failure. I'll write up the report." The caregiver just nodded. She wasn't surprised. Children died. It was a fact of life here. This one had been weak, always crying, wouldn't eat. It was clear he wouldn't last long. The next morning, Billy's bunk was empty, the sheets already stripped. The other children saw it and said nothing. But one of them, a 10-year-old boy named Tommy Miller, made a promise to himself that he would remember. Billy had slept in the bunk next to his. Sometimes they would whisper to each other in the dark. Billy would talk about his mom, about how kind she was, how she used to bake cornbread that smelled like sunshine. Tommy didn't cry. He had learned long ago that crying did no good in this place. But he remembered the name. He remembered the face. He remembered the date. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to start remembering a lot of names. And he had no idea that 11 years later, his memory would change everything. After Billy, there was a quiet period. For 2 months, Amelia Thorne harmed no one. Perhaps she was waiting or observing. Or perhaps she was feeling something: remorse, fear, satisfaction. We'll never know. She never spoke of it. The second victim came in February of 1964. Grace Matthews was 9 years old. She had been at Oak Ridge since birth, left by a single mother who died in childbirth. Her relatives had refused to take her. She was a quiet, withdrawn girl who loved to draw. If you gave her a piece of paper and a pencil, she could sit for hours, sketching mountains and birds and suns, things she had only ever seen from behind the home's wire-meshed windows. Grace had tuberculosis. The diagnosis had been made a year earlier, after she started coughing up blood. She should have been sent to a sanatorium, a special facility for sick children, but there were no beds available. The waiting list was 6 months long. So Grace remained at Oak Ridge, confined to a small, isolated room at the end of the hall. She spent her days there alone, drawing. Amelia visited her every day. She brought her medicine, spoke to her softly, and stroked her hair. "You're in so much pain, sweetie," she would say. "I can see it. It hurts to breathe. It hurts to live." Grace would look at her with trusting eyes. Nurse Amy was the only person who came to see her, the only one who wasn't afraid to enter her room. On the night of February 12th, Amelia brought her a special treat: a glass of warm milk with honey, a rare luxury at the home. Grace drank it gratefully. She fell asleep. She never woke up. The milk had been laced with a fatal dose of sedatives. The cause of death on the certificate, signed by Dr. Albright, was tuberculosis complicated by pneumonia. Grace was buried in the same far corner of the cemetery. No name, just a number. The third victim was in May of that same year. Robert Jones was 6. He had been brought in by the local sheriff, who found him wandering the streets, filthy and starving. His parents were alcoholics. Their last known address was a burned-out shack by the river. The boy couldn't remember their names, only his own. Robert refused to eat. Not because he was being difficult, but because he couldn't. Something inside him was broken: his stomach, his mind, his soul. He would sit at the table, staring at his bowl of oatmeal, unable to lift the spoon to his mouth. The caregivers yelled at him, punished him. It was no use. The boy was wasting away. You could count his ribs. His eyes were sunken and hollow. Amelia watched him for a week. Then one night, she came for him. "You don't have to eat anymore," she told him. "You don't need anything anymore. I'm going to help you." Robert didn't resist. He never resisted anything. The next morning, his bunk was empty. The fourth victim came that September. Dinah Washington was 11 years old, the oldest child Amelia would ever kill. She was smart and observant. Too observant for a place like Oak Ridge. Dinah saw something she wasn't supposed to see. One night, she woke up with a stomach ache and had to use the bathroom down the hall. As she passed the infirmary, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. She peeked inside. She saw Nurse Amy, bent over the examination table. On the table was the still, small body of a child. Amelia was carefully wrapping it in a white sheet, like a small package. Dinah gasped and stumbled back. She ran to her bed and hid under the covers, trembling. She didn't tell anyone. Who could she tell? The caregivers? They were afraid of Nurse Amy themselves. The director? He was always drunk. The police? What police? She was just a kid from the orphanage. No one would believe her. But Dinah made a fatal mistake. She let her fear show. She would flinch whenever she saw Nurse Amy. She would turn away, avoiding her eyes. Amelia noticed. She always noticed. 2 weeks later, Dinah was called to the infirmary for a routine checkup. She went. She had no choice. She never came back. The death certificate read, acute meningitis. Nothing could be done. The fifth victim was in December. Adam Peters was 5 years old, the youngest of them all. He was nonverbal. Maybe he had been born that way, or maybe trauma had stolen his voice. His file simply said mental deficiency, degree unknown. Adam would sit in a corner all day, rocking back and forth. He never cried, never laughed, never reacted to anything. The caregivers mostly ignored him. They fed him by forcing his mouth open and shoving oatmeal inside. They dressed him like a doll. Was he living, or merely existing? Amelia would look at him and see a burden, a miserable creature. A living corpse. "He's defective," Dr. Albright had once remarked to her. "Why do we let ones like this live? They just take up space." Perhaps those words sealed Adam's fate. Or perhaps Amelia had already been thinking the same thing. On the night of December 15th, Adam died. The certificate said cardiac failure. He was 5 years old. He had never spoken a single word. In the year 1964, 5 children died at the Oak Ridge Children's Home. Billy, Grace, Robert, Dinah, and Adam. All from natural causes. All in the middle of the night. All after a visit to the infirmary. 5 children. 5 empty bunks. 5 nameless graves. And it was only the beginning. The years rolled on. 1965, 66, 67. The country was changing. Kennedy was gone, Johnson was in office, and the war in Vietnam was escalating. But in Hollow Creek, life remained stubbornly the same. Oak Ridge Children's Home continued its grim, monotonous routine. Wake up at 7. Oatmeal for breakfast. Lessons, lunch, chores, dinner, bedtime. Children came and went. Some turned 14 and were sent away. A few were taken in by relatives. Even fewer were adopted. And some just disappeared in the night, leaving behind an empty bunk. Amelia Thorne continued her work. Methodically, calmly. She selected her victims according to a specific, twisted set of criteria. First were the ones who cried at night, the ones who couldn't stop calling for the mothers they no longer had. Amelia saw herself in them, the little girl who cried in the hungry winter of 43, who called for a father who would never come home. She was helping them, she believed. She was ending their misery. Second were the sick. The children with tuberculosis, with heart defects, with developmental disabilities. In her mind, they had no place in the world. She called it an act of mercy, freeing them from their suffering. Third were the burdens. The ones who caused trouble, who demanded too much attention, who disrupted the routine. Amelia believed she was doing a service to the children who remained. More food, more space, more attention from the caregivers. It was the logic of madness, cold, calculated, and utterly inhuman. In 1965, there were 6 deaths. In 1966, 5. In 1967, 4. 1968, 5. 1969, 4. 1970, 5. 1971, 3. 1972, 4. 1973, 3. 47 children in 11 years. 47 names that no one remembered. 47 graves without headstones. An average of 4 children a year, just infrequent enough to avoid raising official suspicion. just frequent enough to satisfy a need, to fulfill a mission. Or maybe just because she could. Psychiatrists would later write dissertations, arguing over her diagnosis. Schizophrenia, psychopathy, post-traumatic stress disorder. But no one would ever truly know. Amelia was not insane in a clinical sense. She functioned in society. She went to work, she spoke with her colleagues, she even smiled at the children. No one noticed anything wrong. She was just a killer, methodical and serene, carrying out her duties as if they were part of her job description. The children knew. Or at least, they sensed it. The whispers in the dark never stopped. Each new generation of residents passed down the terrible warnings. Don't cry at night, or Nurse Amy will hear you. Eat all your oatmeal, or she'll come for you. Don't get sick. They take the sick ones away. These weren't scary stories, they were survival guides, paid for with the lives of their friends. Some of the children tried to tell. They spoke to caregivers, to teachers, to the rare visitor who came to the home. But no one believed them. They were just children's fantasies, scary stories, lies. Who would believe an orphan? Who would take a child's word against that of a respected medical professional? Who would even bother to listen? Tommy Miller was one of those who tried. In 1965, when he was 12, he scribbled a note and slipped it to a woman from a county committee who was visiting for an inspection. The note said, "Help us. They kill kids here. The nurse at night." The woman read the note out loud, in front of everyone. Director Sterling shook his head, looking at Tommy with an expression of pity. "Poor boy," he said. "His nerves are shot. It happens with these orphans. Overactive imaginations." The woman from the committee nodded understandingly, patted Tommy on the head, and left. That evening, a caregiver beat him with a belt. Not hard enough to leave a permanent mark, but hard enough for him to remember the lesson. Don't make things up. Don't complain. Don't bring shame on the home. Tommy learned the lesson. But he never stopped remembering the names. In 1973, Tommy Miller was 20 years old. He had been out of Oak Ridge for years. He had served a tour in the Army, and was now working as a long-haul trucker, driving a beat-up Kenworth across the country. He lived in a cheap boarding house in Charleston alone. But he still remembered. Every name, every face, every empty bunk. And he still held on to the hope that one day, somehow, he could make someone listen. March 12, 1974. Tommy Miller sat at a rickety table in his boarding house room. In front of him was a sheet of notebook paper. In his hand was a cheap ballpoint pen. He was 21 now. A grown man. He didn't drink. He'd seen enough of what alcohol did to people at the home. He wasn't married. What kind of family could he have, living out of a suitcase on a trucker's salary? But most importantly, he remembered. Every night, the same dreams replayed in his head. The long, dark hallway of the children's home. The cold floor under his bare feet. The door to the infirmary. The smell of bleach and alcohol. The face of Nurse Amy and her quiet voice. "You're a strong boy. You'll survive." Why him? Why had she spared him? What was it about him that made her decide to let him live? Tommy didn't know. But he knew one thing. He had to tell the story. Otherwise, it would all have been for nothing. All those deaths, all those children, would just be erased, as if they had never existed. He had tried to tell people before, his army buddies, his neighbors, strangers in truck stops. They either didn't believe him, or didn't want to get involved. "That was a long time ago, kid," they'd say. "Why stir up trouble? You'll only make problems for yourself." Everyone was afraid of problems. But Tommy couldn't stay silent any longer. The faces of the dead children were always there, just behind his eyes. Billy, Grace, Robert, Dinah, Adam, and dozens of others. He had to try one more time, a different way. He would write to the most powerful newspaper in the country. If they read it, maybe, just maybe, something would change. Tommy picked up the pen and began to write. "Dear Washington Post, my name is Thomas Miller. I grew up in the Oak Ridge Children's Home in Hollow Creek, West Virginia. I want to tell you about what happened there between 1963 and 1974. He wrote for 3 hours. His hand trembled, but he didn't stop. He listed the names he could remember. He described the infirmary, the white tile, the iron table, the cabinet of syringes, the smell of bleach and alcohol, and that other Swedish scent. He wrote her name, Amelia Thorne, the nurse, the one who killed them. He described how she chose her victims, the ones who cried, the ones who were sick, the ones who wouldn't eat. He described waking up in the morning to see an empty bunk next to him. He described the moment she had patted his head and told him he was strong enough to live. 3 pages, filled with his jagged, desperate scrawl. Every word was a blow. Every name was a stone on a grave. Tommy finished the letter, folded it, and put it in an envelope. He addressed it to the Washington Post in Washington, D.C. He didn't write a return address. He was still afraid. The next day, he dropped the envelope into a mailbox. In 3 days, Joan Higgins would read it. In a week, it would be in the hands of the FBI. And in a month, a special investigation would begin. In April of 1974, a meeting took place in the office of the chief of the West Virginia State Police in Charleston. 3 men sat around a polished table. The chief himself, Colonel Evans, a heavy-set man with a thick gray mustache. Beside him, a quiet man in a plain suit from the FBI, who hadn't given his name. And a third man, Detective Frank Miller, the lead investigator assigned to the case. On the table between them was Tommy's letter. It had been passed up the chain of command, from the newspaper to the FBI, and now to the state police. "This could be a hoax," the colonel said gruffly. "Or the ravings of a lunatic." "Maybe," the FBI agent agreed. "But we have to check it out. If there's even a shred of truth to this, it's a catastrophe. An orphanage, 47 children, 11 years. If it's true," Detective Miller said quietly, "it's not just a catastrophe. I don't even know what you'd call it." The colonel looked at him. Miller was a good cop, 38 years old, a veteran of the force. He'd grown up in these hills himself, and knew the kind of poverty and desperation that could fester in the deep hollers. Maybe that's why they gave him the case. They knew he wouldn't be easily fooled, and he wouldn't back down. "We work this quietly," the FBI agent instructed. "No media, no leaks. If it's confirmed, we'll decide how to proceed. If not, we bury it." "And what if it is confirmed?" Miller asked. There was a heavy silence. "Just do your job, detective," the colonel finally said. "And be careful. This is a politically sensitive matter." Miller nodded. He knew exactly what that meant. Orphanages were supposed to be a showcase of the government's compassion. If it got out that one of these model institutions was a hunting ground for a serial killer, the scandal would be enormous. The politicians wanted it to go away. But Miller was a cop. His job was to find the truth, no matter how ugly or inconvenient it was. On April 16th, Detective Miller drove into Hollow Creek alone. His official cover story was a routine inspection of county facilities. The first thing he did was go to the archives. The county clerk's office, the local hospital, the cemetery. He spent 3 days and nights poring over records, fueled by black coffee and a growing sense of dread. He pulled every document from 1963 to 1973. Death certificates, autopsy reports, the few that existed, morgue logs, burial records. A horrifying picture began to emerge. During that 11-year period, 47 children had died at the Oak Ridge Children's Home. The official causes were all standard childhood illnesses. But Miller saw the patterns, too obvious to be a coincidence. First, the time of death. All 47 children died at night, between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. Not a single death during the day. Second, the place of death. All of them died in the infirmary or the adjacent isolation room. Third, the paperwork. Every single death certificate was filled out in the same neat, backward slanting handwriting, with the signature A. Thorne, RN at the bottom. Fourth, the autopsies. Of the 47 deaths, only 9 had been autopsied, and even those were cursory examinations. No external signs of foul play. That was all. Miller stared at the piles of paper, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The letter wasn't a lie. It was all true. His next step was to find witnesses. He tracked down former residents of the home, the ones who had survived and grown up. Not many of them wanted to talk, but some did. A 30-year-old man who worked at a local factory told him, "Nurse Amy? I remember her. We were all scared of her. Not 'cause she was mean. But, if you went to see her at night, you didn't come back. We knew. We all knew." A 28-year-old woman, now living in Charleston, said, "I saw her lead little Mikey away. He was 6. He cried every night. The next morning, his bed was empty. They said he went to the hospital. But we knew." Miller took down their statements, one after another. The story was always the same. Everyone knew. No one could do anything. The children were powerless, the caregivers were silent, the director looked the other way, and the doctor signed the papers. A perfect system of complicity. On April 23rd, another man arrived in Hollow Creek. Major Victor Stevens from the FBI's regional office. Officially, he was there to supervise the investigation. Unofficially, he was there to control it. Stevens was a career bureaucrat, a man who knew how the system worked and what his bosses wanted. He knew how to make inconvenient problems disappear. "Detective," he said to Miller at their first meeting, "you've done some good work. But there are nuances." "What kind of nuances?" Miller asked, though he already knew the answer. "Political ones. This case cannot become a public circus. We can't allow one incident to tarnish the reputation of the entire system." "One incident?" Miller stared at him. 47 children, Major. 47, over 11 years. All the more reason to handle this discreetly. Imagine the headlines. "It's unacceptable." And what is acceptable? To sweep it under the rug? Stevens gave him a cold, thin-lipped smile. "Detective, I can see you're an idealist. That's admirable, but this is the real world. There will be no public scandal. We can handle this quietly. A closed trial. Minimal publicity. The guilty will be punished. Justice will be served. Everyone's happy. What about the truth?" "The truth," Stevens said, "is a flexible concept." Miller was silent. He knew the Major was right. This is how the system worked. But these were children. 47 dead children. They deserve the truth. They deserve to be remembered. "I'm going to finish my investigation," he said finally. "To the end." Stevens just shrugged. "Go ahead. But remember, I'm here to oversee the process. Every step from here on out goes through me." Miller continued his work. He found Tommy Miller, the man who wrote the letter. They met in his small, grim room in Charleston. Tommy told him everything, pouring out 11 years of bottled-up horror. "Why did you survive?" Miller asked him. Tommy was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said. "She chose us for her own reasons. Maybe I was strong enough. Maybe I didn't cry enough. Maybe I just got lucky." Then Miller went to the orphanage. Director Sterling was in a panic, but tried to play it cool. He showed Miller the pristine records, led him on a tour of the exemplary facility. "The death rate, yes, it's a bit high," he admitted, the smell of gin thick on his breath. "But we have difficult children here, you see. Weak, sickly. We do the best we can." Miller looked at him and knew. This man knew everything. He had enabled it all. "Where is Nurse Thorne?" Miller asked. Sterling's face went pale. "She's on duty. In the infirmary. Get her." Amelia Thorne walked into the director's office. The white uniform, the white cap, the black braid coiled at the back of her head. Her dark eyes were calm, almost empty. She was 45 years old. For 11 years, she had murdered children in this very building. And now a detective stood before her. "Sit down," Miller said. She sat, looking at him without a trace of fear or emotion. "Do you know why I'm here?" "I have an idea." "Then why don't you tell me what's been happening in your infirmary?" A silence stretched between them. Then finally she spoke. "I was helping the children," she said. "The ones who were in pain. The ones who were suffering." "Helping them how?" "I helped them go to sleep. Forever." Miller felt a chill run down his spine. She said it so calmly, as if describing a routine medical procedure. "How many?" 47. Maybe more. I don't remember all their names." "Why?" She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes. It wasn't madness. It was a terrifying certainty. "They were unwanted," she said. "Sick, weak, miserable. Life was a torment for them. I set them free. It was an act of mercy." Miller was speechless. In all his years on the force, he had seen killers of every kind. But he had never seen anything like this. A person who genuinely believed that murder was an act of kindness. A person who could look you in the eye and feel no guilt. It was more terrifying than any monster, because this wasn't a monster. This was just a person. A woman with a dark braid and tired eyes who, somewhere along the way, had broken and twisted into something for which there was no name. "Amelia Thorne," Miller said, his voice hard as steel. "You are under arrest for suspicion of murder." She simply nodded, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. That same day, police searched the infirmary. Detective Miller supervised every moment. It was a small, sterile room, 3 by 4 meters. The cabinet held the usual supplies, bandages, alcohol, glass syringes. But on the bottom shelf, tucked behind a box of gauze, they found a small collection of unlabeled ampoules. And in the corner of the cabinet, they found an old metal candy tin. Miller opened it. Inside was a collection of children's things. A small, tarnished crucifix on a leather cord. A button shaped like an anchor, torn from a sailor suit. An Oktoberfest pin. Several small locks of hair, tied with thread. and a folded piece of paper with a child's handwriting on it. "Mama, I love you. Grace." They were trophies, souvenirs from her victims. Miller stared at the contents of the box, and something inside him clenched. This wasn't professional anymore. This was personal. Every button, every lock of hair was a life. 47 lives ended in this cold, white room. The interrogations lasted for 3 weeks. Amelia spoke freely, almost eagerly, as if she had been waiting for someone to ask. She remembered many of them. Billy the first, who cried for his mother. She had helped him find peace. Grace, with her tuberculosis, who was suffering. She had freed her. Robert, who was starving himself to death. She had ended his misery. Dinah, who had seen too much. She had to be silenced. "Do you understand what you've done?" Miller asked her again and again. And every time, her answer was the same. "I was helping them. You murdered children. I showed them mercy." It was like talking to a brick wall. She felt no remorse. She truly believed she had done the right thing. Psychiatrists evaluated her for a week. Their conclusion: she was legally sane. She fully understood her actions and their consequences. She wasn't schizophrenic or psychotic. She had a severe personality disorder, a warped moral compass, a monstrous and twisted logic. But she was sane enough to stand trial. The co-conspirators were interrogated next. Director Sterling was a pathetic sight. He wept, begged for mercy, and blamed everything on Amelia. "I didn't know," he sobbed. "How could I have known?" "You saw the death reports," Miller pressed. 47 deaths in 11 years. All at night. All in the infirmary. And you didn't notice a pattern? Sterling finally broke. "Yes," he whispered. "I looked the other way. I was so close to my pension. I just didn't want any trouble." Dr. Albright tried to squirm his way out of it, blaming his heavy workload and lack of time. "I trusted the nurse," he insisted. "She was a qualified professional." "And what about the gifts from the director? The bourbon? The favors?" Albright's face went pale. "I didn't know she was killing them." He knew. Or at least, he chose not to know. The legal difference was small, but it was there. Both men were charged with criminal negligence resulting in death. In August of 1974, a closed trial was held at the county courthouse. No public, no press. Major Stevens had gotten his wish. The scandal would be contained. But the trial itself was real. Detective Miller made sure of it. Amelia Thorne was charged with 47 counts of first-degree murder. Arthur Sterling and Evan Albright were charged with negligence. The star witness was Tommy Miller. He spoke for 3 hours, listing the names, the dates, the small, damning details that had haunted him for over a decade. The prosecution presented the metal box of trophies. The lab reports confirmed the ampoules contained lethal doses of sedatives. The stacks of death certificates, all in Amelia's handwriting, were entered as evidence. In her final statement, Amelia Thorne stood before the judge, small and aged, her hair now completely gray. "I did what I did," she said, her voice steady. "I have no regrets. Those children were unwanted. Life was a misery for them. I gave them peace. If that is a crime, then judge me. But in my heart, I know I did the right thing." The courtroom was silent. The verdict was swift. Amelia Thorne was found guilty on all 47 counts and sentenced to death by electric chair. Arthur Sterling was sentenced to 15 years in a federal prison. Dr. Evan Albright was sentenced to 12. The trial was over. Justice, in its formal bureaucratic way, had been served. On October 14, 1974, in a state penitentiary, the sentence was carried out. Amelia Thorne went to her death calmly. Her last words were, "Tell the children. I loved them in my own way." She was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, with only a number to mark her spot. Just like the children she had murdered. Arthur Sterling died of a heart attack in prison in 1978. Dr. Albright was released on parole after serving 10 years. He returned to Hollow Creek and worked as a night watchman at a warehouse, dying of cirrhosis of the liver in 1992. The Oak Ridge Children's Home was quietly shut down in 1976. The building was torn down. Today, it's just an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken bricks. Nothing remains. Tommy Miller got what he wanted. The killer was brought to justice. But the victory felt hollow. He never married, never had a family of his own. The nightmares never left him. He died of a heart attack in 2003 at the age of 50. And what of the 47 children? Their graves, in that forgotten corner of the Hollow Creek Cemetery, are long gone. The wooden markers have rotted away. the painted numbers faded into nothing. No one visits. No one brings flowers. No one even remembers their names. This is a story about the evil that can hide behind a gentle voice and a white uniform. It's a story about a system that chose to look away and a society that forgot its most vulnerable. But most of all, it's a story about the perverse and terrifying idea of mercy killing, of believing you have the right to decide who lives and who dies. Amelia Thorne was not a monster in a fairy tale. She was a broken human being who, in her pain, appointed herself an angel of death. And 47 innocent children paid the price for her perverted sense of mercy. Let this story be a reminder that evil isn't always loud and violent. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it strokes your hair and tells you it's going to help you sleep. And that is the most terrifying evil of all.